Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Domain Analytics. So, today we'll be taking a look at defense analytics. So, when we think about defense, we can think about a lot of things. For example, it could be in reference to some sporting event. All right, if you're playing football, you might be talking about defending. If you're playing cricket, you might be talking about defending again. So basically, in the context of sports, we could be looking at from a legal point of view, right? So if you are talking about it in legal terms, you're talking about the way attorney will try and defend his client in any case, be it civil, be it criminal, whatever it is, right? Whatever the context might be. So, similarly, we can talk about it from a military perspective. Now, when we talk about it from a military perspective, we are talking about the overall defensive strategy of a nation state. So, you're looking at overall strategy. Now, defense is a very broad term. All right. So, essentially, what we mean by defense is we are trying to either defend or resist some type of attack. Now, when we think about defense, we can discuss a lot of great historical events, and we can also talk about it in context of the modern situation. And that is why for this session we will be taking a look at the various defensive strategies that are undertaken by different nations and how we can classify that defensive strategy. We'll be talking about things like military bases, attacking, like bombing and stuff, aerial bombings. We'll be talking about weapons, weapons export import. We'll be talking about how much money is a country spending on defense analytics. So we'll be going through a broad field of defense. All right. So when we think about defense, what all comes to mind? There is a great story in the ancient Greek folklore. Now, obviously, that story is not fully accurate with how it is portrayed, especially in popular media. And that story is not very accurate if you just read it. All right. So we are talking about the ancient Greek military city-state of Sparta. So Sparta, back in the day, back when Greek culture was at its peak, Sparta was one of the most important city-states in the nation. So Greece was not a unified nation. Greece was a nation that was segmented into various small city-states. All right, and Sparta was one of them. Okay, so this was again Greek city-state. So if we understand the geography, Greece at that time was bordered by an empire called Persia. Persia was a Middle Eastern empire and it was bordering Greece. So Persia was a bigger empire. Of course, it was, capturing, it basically controlled all of the Middle East, or what we call it today, all the way from Turkey to Iran. Okay, so they were trying to invade Greece. So as the story goes, 300 Spartans fought at the gates of Thermopylae. Now, Thermopylae was a mountain pass. It was very narrow, very isolated, and it only had one way to go around. So basically, you could only head on straight. So they were trying to defend against an army that was numbering in the lakhs. So as the story goes, 300 Spartans under the leadership of famous king Leonidas, they fought a defensive war against the Persians. And their idea was to fight this war to delay the invasion of Greece just by enough that, that by the time rest of the Greece can unite and it can stand up against the Persians. So they eventually, of course, they lost the war. Right? Of course they would. I mean, we are talking about 300 versus lakhs. They were betrayed by somebody from their own country. That happens. This is part of war. So that is one of the greatest examples of what we can call as a defensive warfare, a defensive war. Greece did not start this war. Greece was not the aggressor in this war. Persia was aggressive because they were trying to expand into that territory. They were trying to take control of the Hellenistic city-states. So this is an example of how defense, since the dawn of mankind, since the day we learned how to group ourselves together, since the day we figured out that, hey, we can band together and we can form cities, we can form towns, we can form empires, nations, etc. All these things. Since then, this concept of defense has been around. Since the days of Babylon. Babylon was famous for its massive walls. Right? Or even a bigger example. Now, many people would have heard about Istanbul. Istanbul is a Turkic city. It is on the Straits of Bosphorus. It is divided between Asia and continental Europe and continental Asia. That is just the current history. But this city was set up by a Roman king known as Constantine the Great. And originally this city was called as Constantinople, named after the person who set up. Talk about having an ego, naming a city after yourself. So Constantinople was based in Bosphorus. It was based on one side, on the European side of the Bosphorus. So it was not based on the Asian side. So, as you know, it was divided by a stretch of sea known as the Bosphorus Strait that cuts right through Istanbul, one of the most strategically important water points in the world at the moment. So, Constantinople had walls, and they had around 5 layers of walls. So for this reason, this city was basically considered impenetrable. Nobody could enter the city by force. So it was basically impossible for, the military to come in and take control of the city. All right. So it wasn't up until, I think, 1458 that Machmut the Great, the Conqueror, whatever name we want to call this guy, he was able to use cannons to breach the walls of the city, and that was when the city fell. And this city was founded around 300 AD. So it stood for, almost 12 centuries. And it stood that time because it was an excellent position as a defensive strategy, right? So this is in the back olden days. We are talking about, way back when we people were fighting with swords and arrows, right? Since that time, we have had the concept of forts, fortifications, strong boundaries, strong villages, like strong structures that, help people, that house armies. And these forts were basically the choke points within which a nation's uh, entire defensive strategy was placed. So one of the most common, most popular modern example is the Mirunnik line. This was a defensive line that was built up by the French on the German border. Sorry, this is Maginot line, not Maginot. That is a person's name. Maginot line. So this was basically a set of defensive fortifications stretching from the border of Switzerland all the way through the Ardennes forest and basically into Belgium. So it basically covered the entire entry of the French and the German border. So basically it was a series of fortifications that was built by the French in an anticipation of the German invasion. Now, if you know about the World War, you would know that the Germans went through the Ardennes forest, caught French by surprise, etc., etc. But the Maginot line, it never fell. Why did it not fall? Because this was a very strong series of fortresses that were basically dug into the ground. So it was impossible for the troops to take it. If you go around it, that's a different matter, right? So why are we talking about all these fortifications? Why are we talking about all these historical figures that may or may not have been mythical? We are talking about this because we are trying to learn about defense analytics. And to understand what is defense analytics, we have to understand the context behind defense, right? Defending can be of multiple types. You could be defending against a foreign invader. So you're trying to protect your land, right? Some guy is coming from the other direction, from the opposite direction. Again, this is, these two are again classic examples of defending against invading forces. We can also talk about, the various people who have fought a guerrilla war against an invading force. For example, in the Vietnam War, it was never a direct war because the North Vietnamese soldiers, they were never directly engaging with the American soldiers. They were always fighting in, they were always fighting in a series of guerrilla warfare tactics. So that is how this terminology comes into the picture. So what we are trying to understand is how we can learn and how we can use AI and ML to help us understand the various kinds of defense strategies that can be used. So again, now what is this picture conveying? This picture is conveying how the modern war is fought. Okay, we are looking at a soldier reading a book. Could be any kind of book, could be a book he is interested in, could be a strategical book, anything. But the point here is that he is reading a book and at the same time he is holding a laptop. Now this laptop can contain very important information, or maybe he's just chatting with someone, right? When we talk about AI and ML in defense, we are talking about how the technology of AI and ML can be implemented to secure the defensive strength of a nation. Okay, we are talking about the overall war strategy, right? Obviously, we are talking about war in a very defensive manner. Okay, we are not talking about you going out to fight someone. We are talking about somebody coming in to fight you. But there is the concept of obviously there is obviously the concept of preemptive defensive strategy. So what are we trying to achieve with this preemptive defense strategy? What we are trying to do here is we are trying to see how we as users, we as people can fight a war before it starts, before people attack you, you go and attack them, or you don't just directly go and fight them. Maybe you create a buffer zone between your territory and their territory. This could be in the form of a peace treaty, or you could be building fortifications. There are many ways in which this can be done. One of the most common approaches in today's society is military bases. Countries are establishing military bases in foreign countries as part of defensive strategy. All right. So what are we trying to use this defensive strategy for? We are trying to ensure that using a forward operating base, a forward defensive position, you secure your nation. Instead of waiting for the opponent to strike at you, you ensure that they don't get the opportunity to go that far. Now, this is, of course, an American soldier. And if we talk about why America has been involved in wars recently, like last 20, 30 years, it all points to 9/11. Yesterday was the 21st anniversary of 9/11. So it's been more than 2 decades since the planes crashed into the Twin Towers in New York. So in order to protect themselves from ever having to deal with a situation like this, what America thought was, what if we go forward and we build that defensive line in forward? We just ensure that they don't get the opportunity to ever come back and attack our country ever again. We ensure we secure our own borders, so it can never cause another issue. Right. So this is one of the ways in which people are thinking about the defensive strategy today. But now we have to think about a very important point here. America is, across the globe from Afghanistan. How do you how do you send your troops? Simple. You take your, aircraft carriers, you launch an invasion into that country, and then later on, you just land your forces. And that's it. You establish bases. But what after you establish bases? What if that base is set up in a very, very isolated environment? Right? You obviously will always have some sort of isolation because you're going to a country with very little to no infrastructure whatsoever. Infrastructure that has been for the longest time, ruined by war. Right? So what can you do here? Well, you need to have some sort of logistics. And logistics, since day one, have played a very important role in warfare. All right, logistics. Logistics is how you're going to move your troops. We are talking about troop movement. We are talking about supplies. Now, this supplies can mean, food, etc. The basic necessities. We are talking about weapons. All right. So we are talking about all these things and how they can be used. All right. So it is always very important to ensure that your supply lines, your logistics are working properly. Okay. We have to think about logistics as the core principle of warfare. Now, going back to the historical example, the Grand Army of Napoleon was the most dominant army in Europe in its heyday. Napoleon, with his well-drilled soldier, was winning wars and battles all over Europe, continental Europe, like nobody's business. The army was well trained. The army was well drilled. They were very well disciplined. They were loyal to their commander-in-chief. That was Napoleon. And they were fighting against, foreign people, foreign invaders. Because if we take a step back into the history of Napoleonic era France, and just a little bit before that, when the French Revolution broke out, the European powers, they tried to attack France to nip the bud of revolution before it became a serious matter. So France was invaded. They counterattacked. They won. Napoleon himself was responsible for a lot of victories in the Italian peninsula, and he was also able to almost push his way into Austria. He was actually in Austria. Austria's capital at that time, and even today, was Vienna. And he was about, I think, 100 kilometers away from Vienna. And if he wanted, he could have probably marched all the way to the capital of his enemy's country and captured it. But he did not, because he realized that would be a futile exercise. It would just serve to tire his troops. So they hammered out a treaty, etc., whatever. Long story short, Napoleon one day becomes the Emperor of France. He's fighting against all of Europe. So Napoleon wanted an alliance with Russia, but Russia was convinced otherwise. Being hurt, Napoleon launched an invasion of Russia. He took his grand army, some 4 lakh strong, into the Russian mainland. He launched the attack in, just give me a second, please. Sorry about that. So he attacked Russia. He went in the summer, but Russians decided not to fight him. Instead, they kept retreating back and back into their country, and they followed a scorched earth strategy, and they were also fighting a guerrilla war. Eventually, winter hit, and it was a very harsh winter. And the Napoleonic army was not prepared for such a winter, and they were starving and they were freezing to death. Eventually, they had to march back, and I think they were left with some 15,000 men marching all the way back to France from Russia. They lost about 90% of their army. Why did it happen? Because they did not secure their logistical supply chain. Their supply chain was constantly harassed. It was stretched too thin. They were not able to resupply the military, the army in time. So again, since the very first day, logistics have been a very important part of, military strategy. Now, in the modern world, we are no longer fighting a few hundred kilometers or few thousand, away from your home country. Now you are going all the way across continents. You're flying to various corners of the world. And when you're flying to these corners, it becomes extremely difficult to maintain and hold these logistics. So in a scenario like this, we try to ensure that whatever troops you're sending to any corner of the world, they're able to, keep themselves supplied. Similarly, if you are fighting an invading army, how do you fight against that invading army? What is the solution here? The solution here is quite simple. The solution here is that we are trying to ensure that whatever troops are involved in any sort of warfare, they are not, undersupplied. They are getting the maximum possible, value for their efforts. And this value can be achieved by providing them with the proper logistics. So logistics play a very important role in warfare. And now using AI and ML, we can try to improve these logistical lines. And it has been one of the key aspects of the American war in Afghanistan. America has partnered up with IBM, and IBM has their own AI known as IBM Watson, their supercomputer. So the US Army has been partnering with the IBM Watson. They're basically sourcing IBM Watson as a service from the organization. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to ensure that wherever they may be, whatever the situation may be, their supply chains are properly existing. There is no gaps in those supply chains. Okay. So using IBM Watson, a supercomputer, we can ensure that our logistics work. Okay. So again, US being the forefront in military equipment, military tactics, military spending all over the world, whatever military related terminology you can come up with, America being the leader, they obviously will be leading in this as well. Similarly, we have, various automated weapons system. Now here we are not talking about things like drone. drones are still controlled by humans to a great extent. Excuse me. We are talking about systems that react as a response to an attack. Things like missiles, self-defense system, and we have Israel's Iron Dome. So what is the purpose of these systems? The purpose of these systems is to reduce the dependency on humans and give a greater amount of control to machines. Now that sounds very dangerous, right? When somebody says that hey, what if machines decide to do something that we don't want them to do? Well, that is not a scenario that we can come up with unless suddenly tomorrow we have sentience within the machines. They are going to do the task we tell them to do. They are not going to deviate from that task. So that is why we are depending so much on these automated weapon systems. And these get integrated with your army, with your navy, with your air force, and in some cases, even with your space force. So if you have satellites and stuff, you can use that as a measure of defense. Okay. So we are talking about things like spy satellites that are just sent out to space, and all they do is collect information and send it back to us. All right. So what this will do is this will reduce maintenance requirements because these systems are self-sustainable. They're designed to last a long time without having any issues. Okay. And these systems, they can help us launch synchronous attacks. What this means is that if you have an invading force coming your way, you can use these systems to launch an attack on the invading force by using multiple various defensive installations. So you don't have to worry about coordination between various military groups. You don't have to worry whether the Air Force and the military will coordinate with each other. No, that will be taken care by itself. That will be all done by itself. So this allows for us to have a faster response time. Threat is detected and the attacks, the defensive attacks, sounds very funny to say, defensive attacks, they begin. All right. So similarly, we also have to worry about cyber war. So these cyber warfares can also break out at any time, and you're putting your system at risk against a foreign belligerent. All right. So you're putting your troops at risk. So what we can do is we can integrate AI into these systems. So not only does it become independent, they also become, more secure. Your level of security increases. The overall risk to your the overall risk to your soldiers decreases. The overall risk to your defensive strategy decreases. Okay. All right. Then it can help us identify our targets. Now, when we talk about urban warfare, or we are talking about, maybe jungle or mountains or any sort of natural obstacle that can allow your enemies to, hide out, to secure their positions. We can use the target recognition system to help us identify where the targets are. Similarly, it can also help us identify individuals. So if you have, let's say, a most wanted list and you have a bunch of people on that most wanted list, how do you figure out, whether the person you are trying to target is actually on your most wanted list or not? That is something that has to be done, right? So that is one of the things that we can use AI for. Not only are we going to be able to locate our targets, we will also be able to identify individual targets. Okay. So again, we have DARPA in the US, and they are using a trace system, which is a target recognition and adaptation in contested environment. Okay. So what this does is this uses AI algorithms. All right. And it can identify them using the SAR images, which is basically nothing but synthetic aperture satellite images. All right. So these synthetic aperture radar images. Okay. So they are not only able to locate the target, they are also able to identify them. All right. So we can use AI and ML for target recognition. Similarly, we have robotics. Now, robotics is one of the most useful, practically useful application of AI. Building some autonomous machines that can perform human-like tasks for you in a human-like manner is very important. All right. So, when we talk about battles, when we talk about wars, it is always, from the very first day, it has been a very dangerous situation to be in. Right? It is always very risky. Now, of course, the soldiers are already putting their life at risk. But again, it is war. So we don't know. We don't really know, like, when something bad is going to happen. We cannot prepare for it. Of course, we have medics whose only job is to take care of the wounded and the injured in the battlefield. But then you're putting the life of these medics at risk. right? So again, what are we doing here? We are just basically, you know, forcing more and more human risk, more and more risk to human life. Why not try to mitigate it, right? Here we can use robots to perform various tasks for us. We are talking about like these little machines, Wally and things that can move and maneuver within a battlefield at a much greater agility, accuracy, and speed than a human. And they can be a much smaller target for the enemy to aim at. So what is this robots they are going to do? Well, they can help your medics. They can run supply wherever it is needed, right? They can also do basic operations in the field, whatever basic operations are required, like stitching a wound or something, that can be performed by a robot. So the potential for usage of these robots is quite drastic. Okay. Another major risk is IEDs, which is basically like mines. So these are always very random, dangerous. So of course, in order to remove them, we have the bomb squads. But then you're putting human life at danger. What if we can just avoid that situation? What if we don't have to worry about hurting somebody else? If we can just, you know, take care of it. We can use, robots that can be automated, that may even be controlled by a human, right? Basically, we are sending a machine. This machine will perform all the basic requirements. It will be able to, diffuse the bombs. And if it is not able to diffuse the bomb, you might lose a very expensive robot, but at least you will not lose an even more expensive human life, right? And finally, we can use these robots as scouts. You can send them into enemy territory, and you can have them map out the battlefield for you. You can have them, map out the locations of the enemy. You can discover all the weak points. Where are the strong points that you want to avoid? So you can do all these things using your robots. Okay. So this can also help a lot when the enemy is hidden or it is camouflaged. Okay. So this is one of the applications of AI within the scope of military warfare. We can use it for robotics. And then we finally have surveillance. Now, surveillance is another very important task in modern warfare. Of course, surveillance has again something that has been around for a very, very long time. Okay. So we are trying to monitor our borders or any foreign defensive holdings. All right. So, of course, this is very, very important. Right? This is something that we have to keep in mind. All right. So it can help us maintain, a greater point of view on our defensive positions. We can help identify, various people who might be trying to attack you, right? We could be using drones to monitor your borders because these drones can cover greater distance at a faster speed, and they can, cover it, what do you call it, multiple times, where a human would take only maybe one time to cover that specific stretch. We can use these drones to capture the any sort of leakages we have within our borders, any sort of weaknesses, and we can use these drones as we can use these drones to also identify enemy movement pattern. So all these things can be covered. These are just basic examples of the scope of defense analytics. Of course, we have AI. AI stands for artificial intelligence. So when we talk about AI, we are talking about our ability to give machine its own ability to think and behave like humans. Of course, this is not as good as human thinking, but it is able to perform the tasks we want it to perform good. Then ML is a subset of AI. This is basically machine learning. Here we are teaching our machines to behave like humans. Here we are teaching our machines to solve problem like humans. So it is a small portion of AI. And then we have deep learning, which is basically your neural networks. This is basically how a brain would work, is what we are trying to replicate in this. So this is a flow chart of what AI and ML looks like. So we'll be focusing on AI and ML, and deep learning can maybe come into the picture some other day. So let's take a look at what we'll do throughout this course. Today, we have taken a look at the applications. We have introduced ourselves to the basic concept of AI and ML. All right. So we are just trying to understand what happens in AI and ML. Then we'll be spending some time on CRISP MLQ methodology. This is your project SOP for machine learning and AI. Basically, this is a procedural step that has been prescribed for various AI related problems. All right. So we'll try to understand what CRISP MLQ is, what it does, how it can be used, right? And then basically the idea is, just like we have Lean Six Sigma or any other such algorithm, we can also have, a procedure for machine learning projects to make sure that they are working properly. And then from day 3, we'll start and we'll jump into the actual ML and AI part of the project. So we'll be covering what we try to do with the data before we get into the ML models. Then we'll be going through various different kinds of ML models that will help us understand how machine learning and AI is useful for our use case. All right. So this will be a 8-day course, Monday to Friday. We'll meet every day at 4 to 5, unless there is some change in the schedule. And we'll go through this entire week and portion of next week to try and understand what we are doing here. All right. So thank you everyone for joining, and we'll be seeing you tomorrow.